everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. This episode of the show is being sponsored by my friends over at a company called Real Mushrooms, realmushrooms.com. Sky Chilton and his father, Jeff Chilton. I interviewed Jeff a number of episodes ago. Really interesting guys. I really enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. And it's a company that sells and distributes medicinal mushrooms in powder or capsule form. I was really happy to have these guys come on. I think they were very much in alignment with the values of the podcast. As you all know, a big part of this podcast is about plant medicine, holistic medicine, and I think the benefits of medicinal mushrooms are truly fantastic, and I think there's really a growing body of work that's really showing and alluding to all of the amazing properties that mushrooms have. They sell a lot of different mushrooms, things you've probably heard of, like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. Those are all mushrooms I work with. They're part of what I consider for myself a really holistic supplement regime. And the thing I really love about their company, not only are they really good guys, I think they're really ethical guys, but the product is really amazing. It's all 100% mushrooms. They're organic, and that's really rare. For better or for worse, the supplement industry is highly unregulated, and so often when you get supplements, you don't necessarily know what you're getting. You may be getting some mushroom, you may be getting a bunch of fillers and other things. Oftentimes, even when you're buying what may be a mushroom, it may not have any of that mushroom in it at all, unfortunately. Even some of the big, I think even the biggest company that sells mushrooms, actually it's not the fruiting body, not the mushroom itself. It's the mycelial, which is grown on grain, and then those things are mixed up and then sold in a supplement form. So not only are you not getting the mushroom itself, you're getting the mycelium mixed with grain. So it's one of the amazing things of Real Mushrooms is it's exactly that. It's real mushrooms. So it's 100% mushrooms, organic. So you're getting a really good product. You're getting the actual fruiting body, the mushroom itself, 100% of that. And again, just really great guys. I'm really happy to have them on and supporting this podcast. So if you'd like a really good product, you'd like to start working with medicinal mushrooms, check out their site, realmushrooms.com. And also listeners of this show, if you go to their site, realmushrooms.com/universe, you get 25% off your first order, which is a really good deal. And I think once you start working and tasting their products, you'll really see and feel a big difference. So thank you to them. And I think that's it. And without further ado, here is the intro to the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. On this episode, I sat down with Joe Moore. Joe's a really fascinating guy. I was on his podcast, Psychedelics Today, probably about a year ago now. So it was really a pleasure and an honor to have him on my podcast. We got in some really interesting topics. We talked a bit about his podcast, Psychedelics Today, transpersonal psychology, Stanislav Grof, who's, I think, really one of the pioneers and really founders of the kind of psychedelic movement, plant medicine movement. And we talked a lot about drug policy, the kind of second psychedelic renaissance. Joe is in Colorado, which is really at the forefront of a lot of that movement, and really just talking about the kind of future outlook, what's happening there, the direction that a lot of this is moving, some of the issues that come up. We also talked a bit about the environment and how psychedelics may play a role in that. So it was a really good and fascinating conversation, and I think you all will really enjoy it. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to these shows, bonus material, Q&As. To all the people who have done that, to all of the patrons, as always, thank you very much for your support. And if you're able to do that, thank you in advance. Something I really like about websites like Patreon and other platforms like that is they really work on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from these podcasts, learning, that's an amazing way to support this podcast and to support me and continuing to bring on these hopefully very fascinating guests. If you're not able to do that, as always, helping with the algorithms is a really big help. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving any questions or comments in the comment section, that really helps with the algorithms. Also, there's video versions on Spotify and Rumble now. And then if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, leaving a starred rating and a short review is a really big help. Following the show, and also with Spotify now, you can leave a starred rating as well. So I think that's it. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Joe.
Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze. Running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, cool, man. Well, thank you for coming on. It was actually a pleasure for me to have you on, and I was on your podcast. I don't know, it was probably a year ago maybe. Now. Yeah. And I really enjoyed it, and I think you all are doing really, really good work over there. And I think it's great, just how much that platform has grown and the audience it's getting to. And I think shows like yours are really important. Kind of as we talked about when we were on. I'm coming at it a bit more from kind of the traditional, more like indigenous side. I spent a long time in the Peruvian Amazon, and I've always been really interested in just kind of esoteric practices and religions and spirituality, although I think that's something you're also quite interested in.
Yes.
But it's been interesting seeing kind of this more modern take on kind of how these plants and substances are moving out of their traditional setting into the world at large, which, a lot of people have different views on, and there's a whole host of topics that come around that. But I think for me, in its most basic form, it's like anything. Like you can't stop something that's in motion, and so how do you make it really good, and how do you take all these benefits, which are happening so much on such a big scale. So I think it's great what you're doing. So maybe just to start, you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are, and some of the work that you do.
So I'm a psychedelic podcaster, educator, event producer. I've been studying the space pretty heavily from the transpersonal psychology perspective since about 2001, when I started bumping into the work of Dr. Stanislav Grof as part of my undergrad, and I just ran with it. I took the study of psychedelics and the transpersonal and holotropic breathwork far more seriously than I did any of my studies at school, and they were all in tandem. So, I'm from New Hampshire, in the United States originally. Grew up on a small little farm, and now I'm living in Colorado. Psychedelics today is about 7 years old in a couple of weeks, so I'm really pumped about that. Coming up on 5 million downloads, which is lovely. And
congratulations!
Yeah, thank you. And we just wrapped our first cohort of Vital, which is our very large training program. We tried to develop something that's in our mind better than the MAPS or CIIS training. So I think we executed well on that, and we just kicked off round 2, and we've got about 190 students in there this year. So really pumped about that. And 500 something episodes. In our podcast, it's not the typical podcast, right? Where you have an individual just wants to, yell a bunch of stuff or whatever. We on purpose found less highlighted voices for years to build the field. It was too insular, right? It was like 3 or 4 clicks that seemed to be getting most of the attention, and we wanted to really level the playing field and make it more interesting for everybody, including us, right? Like I love Rick Doblin, but how many times can I hear him say the same story again, right? It's and he usually adds things, but it's, there's more voices. And that was kind of a founding impetus. And the other founding impetus was really to highlight transpersonal psychology, which was not getting highlighted whatsoever at the point we started in the space. It was a dirty word, and I think we've done a good job bringing it back, and it's inclusive of all of our practices, all of these esoteric practices and experiences. So it's not like exactly Western centric, Eurocentric. It's weird states happen, and we should be studying them. Things that are hard to explain do happen, and to pretend they don't is really ignorant and harmful to lived experience. And that was a really core thing for us as well. Yeah. Hopefully that's enough, Jason. I'm happy to answer other questions, though.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about transpersonal psychology? I would imagine for a lot of the audience, some of them have heard of it, but I would imagine they don't necessarily have a super deep understanding of what it is. And also Stanislav Grof, because I think he's someone who, I mean, he was really a pioneer in this field and kind of taking, we talk about the psychedelic renaissance now, but it's kind of like the second psychedelic renaissance, because it really started to happen in the 50s, 60s. And he was really one of the pioneers of that. And really in response to eventually the illegalization of some of these substances, but finding ways to work, which I have a lot of respect for him for that, because it's really working within the model that you're allowed to, and then creating something new from that, which is, I think, quite profound.
I found this out tragically late in my studies, that Stan Grof survived not only Soviet occupation of his home city, but also Nazi occupation of his home city, Prague. And I find that amazing that he lived through that. So let's start with transpersonal psychology, though. So transpersonal, I'm going to read a definition from Wiki, and we can kind of riff on it a little bit. So transpersonal psychology, it's kind of a specialty or subfield in psychology that integrates the spiritual and transcendent aspects of the human experience with the framework of modern psychology. So obviously, mid 1800s, psychology wasn't too well developed, right? And eventually they said, okay, let's just study what is reasonable to study. When we, started fleshing this whole field out, and reasonable kept shrinking, to the point where it kind of got reduced to stimulus response. That's all we're looking at. And we're looking primarily at pathology, right? We're not looking at positive or interesting, helpful states, generally speaking, right? Because the focus of psychology is to, theoretically get sick people well again. And what about people who have an enlightenment experience? Like, where do they fit in? Like, if we're really doing psychology, which is the study of the psyche, these things are experiences that happen. Communication with spirits, identity with animals, the experience of being the whole planet or rainforest at once. Like, all of these things are the weird experiences that do happen, but they fit outside. They're not the average experience for people, right? Like, the average experience is like, oh, I'm kind of upset that I have to go to work or something. Or, still upset about how my mother treated me on Christmas, or whatever it is, for people. And, just being able to take a real look and treat those experiences as real experiences for the humans who actually lived through that experience, and validating it and helping people work with it. Like that, transpersonal psychology you could think of as kind of more of a research thing, but I think there are plenty of transpersonally informed therapists doing work with people that have these states. Like, there's a whole field now called spontaneous transformative experiences. So you don't even need to be in the jungle. You could be sitting in traffic in a suburb of New York City and have a full-blown mystical experience. And we don't know why that happens, but we need, from the therapist point of view, you should still be able to work with that and help people get through that, because it can be earth-shattering, just like psychedelic experiences can be. The endogenous mystical states can be equally as, earth-shattering for folks. So that's kind of transpersonal psychology. And then Stan Grof is he's a Czech psychiatrist. He's coming of age, I believe, during the Soviet occupation. It was illegal to own books by Freud at that point. He somehow got his hands on one, and he was on track to be a cartoonist, like a Soviet cartoonist, and then read the book all night long. I think it was something about dream interpretation, maybe. I forget the name of the Freudian book, but it was earth-shattering to him. Then he jumped into med school, jumped into psychiatry, started doing very illegal underground Freudian psychoanalysis, which, it's funny, like we can have that kind of perspective today on psychedelic work when done domestically in the US or other kind of places where it's not legal yet. And he was underimpressed and kind of like regretted taking the path. Really slow, really expensive, really like kind of obnoxiously onerous Freudian psychoanalysis. And then eventually, while he's doing research at one of the hospitals, maybe at med school, maybe right after, LSD showed up at the lab, and they needed to find things to do with it. And somebody dosed him while he was under a strobe light, maybe, that was entrained to his brainwaves. And as the first light kind of exploded, he had a very large mystical experience. And he said, okay, I think he went in a mechanistic atheist and came out a devotee to Shiva, is his turn of phrase there. And what a transition in, a small, 6-8 hour experience, and dedicated the rest of his life to it. Eventually had his own whole research hospital, I believe, doing inpatient psychiatric care with LSD, had extraordinary results at a period of time where progress on psychiatric issues is really hard to get. So just endless, amazing stories of healing and transformation of his patients in the hospital. And eventually was able to sneak out to the United States, got hooked up with some people in Maryland, started working at Hopkins, Spring Grove Psychiatric Research Hospital, a few other places, and really, really got a lot of amazing work done there. Then the drug war happened. He had to escape over to Esalen, Esalen on the coast of Big Sur, south of San Francisco, offered him a position as like a scholar in residence to write, because he hadn't really written a bunch of books yet about all of his insight and work. And that's where he developed holotropic breathwork, which is what I've spent a lot of time with and has been probably my primary healing modality through my life. And no drugs, big experiences, as big as many big psychedelic experiences. I think I had a accidental 10 to 20 hits of LSD overdose once, and my biggest breathwork experiences was bigger than that. So I still believe in it, even though we're at psychedelics today here on my side. So really committed to that. And one way to look at Grof, he's kind of a synthesis of Freud and Jung, and Reich, and some of that camp too. So it's how do we build a bridge between the personal biological lived experience and this transpersonal thing that seems obvious. So it's, what is the map of the psyche? How do these spiritual entities or, non-physical entities relate to us? Or how should we at least interpret and work with them? So it's kind of a merging of like the spiritual and the matter. So it's like a really interesting framework. I'm reeling a little bit, but I think that was probably a good starter dose, maybe.
How do you view that kind of that bridge making? Because that seems to me like a really important point we're at. I mean, I think often even things like language fail us. We talk about Western models or traditional models, indigenous models. But I think even being interested in someone like Stanislav Grof, I think, as you said, it is already beginning to create that bridge making, like between Freud and Jung, between the shamanic and the more Western psychiatric model, and it seems like we've put these things in boxes. I mean, even something like the very idea of psyche, we seem to have maybe even lost the more traditional way in which that was approached, which, psyche actually referred to like soul or spirit or this mind body connection. And yet we seem to now have like compartmentalized it as to someone sitting on a couch and talking about childhood experiences. And we've kind of forgotten in that Greek context, like all of the other things that went along with that. I mean, the whole idea of a liberal arts education, like educating yourself on math and science and the cosmos, and going into Aleutian rites to have a death and rebirth experience. And, it seems like we've kind of cut a lot of these things out of our culture. And it seems like we're at an interesting point where I think that bridge making is a very vital part of the culture we're coming at. And yet we still seem a bit stuck in boxes of reducing things. And it seems hard to find people who can kind of speak to different aspects of this and do that in very important function of bridge making.
Endlessly complex. I like the easy option is for me to just be, disparaging of modern, really well-funded psychology research. And that's not the right move for me. I want to keep trying to put things together and challenging people working in these labs to say, hey, like perhaps you're excluding data here, and that's not really good science. If your theory has bits of data that are that don't, well, if there's bits of data that don't fit neatly into your theory, there's something fundamentally wrong, and it deserves attention. And the way a lot of these folks deal with it is, well, it's obviously lies, or it's obviously delusions, and it's not real. Like nothing that they experienced was real, so therefore we don't need to look at it. And to me, that's troubling, and it's dehumanizing, and something that we need to really be careful with. Because one thing we should carefully consider is that the human experience is one of the most valuable things in the universe, in my opinion. And I'm sure there's other things that are more valuable, but I don't know about them yet. That and, all of the complex genetic diversity on the planet are the two most valuable things in my world. And, how do we juxtapose those two really disparate things on top of each other? And it's carefully, slowly. And from my perspective, I don't say things like, oh, Mother Ayahuasca wanted me, to learn this. Like, I don't say that. I'm comfortable when other people say it because I understand their experience. I want to stay a little bit model agnostic because, even saying something like that, in a way, puts it in a box, right? I had this experience and it felt kind of like this. I don't know what it was. And how could anybody know what it is, really? But largely they're helpful and they're amazing. And there's so much awe that can come from that. But then, how do you balance that with, cognitive behavioral therapy done in, really ugly, hospital in a city, with, perhaps MDMA thrown in the mix? Like how? But that said, even in those ugly hospitals with MDMA doing, a type of therapy that I'm not a super big fan of, can have extraordinary results and can have those religious experiences we were kind of chatting about there. And there's so much left to explore, that I like to say we're at the beginning. Like psychology is young as hell. Like we barely got rigorous methodologies in place, in the last 40 years. And there's still subpar research going around. So, I also like to say things like humans have been using these substances just about on all continents for a very long time, many thousands of years. And to suppose that, we need this kind of like dehumanizing research before we can use this stuff at scale. Like, I always want to challenge that too. Like, humans have always had relationship with substance and drugs and other things, sacraments, and that's another thing that I love defending. And I think it's really important. So it's kind of like a cognitive liberty deal, but it's more, it's probably that, and that I hate identifying as that, but it's kind of true, because, and then I start going into the drug war from cognitive liberty and, trying to fight that. So it's a series of things, like, because those people can do really boring, well-funded research and we can barely fund transpersonal research, there's a bias in culture towards that more behaviorist, like, we're just simple soulless animals, automatons. Like, it's easier for them to get that, and it's easier for them to, like, cut us down a bunch. So I'm always trying to, like, stand up for that. But you're right. Like, this is the juxtaposition is hard, but I just think we need to keep pushing and keep reminding, saying, well, what about this experience that my friend had without drugs? Or, you died and you came back and you had a really wild story. Like, what do we do with that? And how do we understand it? And how do we work with it? They often want to reduce it to electrical blips. It's like, I don't know. I think neuroscience has a long uphill battle to get to its, goal. I don't know that it'll finally get to its goal, but I applaud neuroscience trying to, because it's going to serve us all, I think, globally pretty well in the long term. But yeah, I'm floundering again, going off the rails a bit, but hopefully that touched a little bit of the juxtaposition part.
Yeah. So you're in Colorado, and that seems to be one of the areas that's really at the forefront of kind of this second, what's described as a psychedelic renaissance. What would you describe is going on there, and why do you think Colorado specifically is at the forefront of this? And like, what do you see happening? And because a lot of people are listening from the States, but not necessarily from Colorado. A lot of people are listening from abroad, from other countries. And I think there's a lot of focus, particularly on Colorado, as this kind of experiment of where these things are going. So can you kind of just describe, I know it's kind of a big question, but describe what's going on there and where you see things headed?
Yeah. So Prop 122 is a thing that Colorado voters were able to evaluate and vote on this past fall. I think it was November, and I think it passed with a 54% margin. And there was a whole decriminalized frame where people could do unregulated services around psilocybin, mescaline, iboga, and DMT. And so meaning people could run ceremony and can effectively legally. Like, this isn't, as we've seen, lowest law enforcement priority. This is straight up, if the cops try to take it from you, if they search you, you could sue the police. And I find that extraordinary. And then the second part is a regulated frame. So we'd have certified facilitators of different types. We'd have centers to go to, testing facilities, certified growers, licensed growers, things like that. One major amazing provision was that doctors, clinicians, based on the bill, will have their license protected if they choose to work in this space, whereas in Oregon, that was not the case with their mushroom bill. So I think we're going to see really great clinical inclusion as part of this, and that should drive performance and safety a little bit. And a few more things about the decrim part. It means that I can grow and share all of those compounds I listed before in plants. This is primarily a plant bill, which was the politically feasible thing to do at the time. I'm more inclined towards all drug decrim because 100,000 overdose deaths a year is not okay in America. Primarily, not to mention the prison part. But yeah, so we'll get
and
there.
with that overdose, the idea being that a lot of those overdoses are happening because these substances are illegal. And so people are getting like altered substances or things that maybe not, they might not be what they say they are. And is that the idea?
Yeah. And potency being impossible, right? Like imagine if every ibuprofen you took was like totally inconsistent. So like the standard dose being like 200 milligrams, right? But what if one pill was 20 milligrams and the next one was 2000? Like you could theoretically run into some serious health problems there. So that's a big deal. Yeah. And the drug war is something that I could go on about forever. But we're seeing progress. And what I'm excited about is I'm hearing about policemen being interested in microdosing or doing trauma work. Military communities are healing. Like we need all these people back. Like we need everybody on the team to help with this climate crisis and every other part of our multifaceted crisis we're experiencing right now. So how this works is people can possess and walk around. Like I could drive all over the state with mushrooms in my pocket, DMT in my pocket, whatever it is. You can't consume in a public space yet, which is a little tricky. So like doing work in the forest could be a little complicated legally, though perhaps you could consume at home and walk out there, or an Airbnb or whatever it is. But I'm seeing clinics being interested in acquiring property here to do, ayahuasca facilitation or other modalities. I think iboga for opiate addiction is going to be a really big one here in Colorado soon. And yeah, it was a really big battle. I don't know if you watched it from the outside much, but Decriminalized Nature versus a lot of the more well-funded, better organized groups. Decriminalized Nature made a 1 or 2 page bill that just pretty much said everything should be decriminalized. It did not get much of the vote. I thought perfect would have been if both went through, both of the bills. But the idea that peyote should be excluded was really controversial. I'm a strong believer that existing states should be trying to get the opinion of what Native groups live there before pushing groups, laws like this through. And there were specific requests from the Native American Church to exclude peyote, so that it was mainly around a sustainability and cultural respect framework. Whenever I see like John Mayer on Instagram with like a peyote t-shirt, I go a little bonkers about it. So what we will see is expanded interest in Colorado. People will be moving here, similar to what happened with cannabis, around kind of like medical refugee status. Like I need help. Like I met people who had to move because their 6-year-old couldn't legally get CBD and cannabis to stop their seizures. I'm like, that's crazy. So they had to move to Colorado from a refugee situation. And we'll get the same stuff with psychedelics for sure. Probably cluster headache community would be one. Chronic pain community would be a big one too, I bet. So we're going to see that. We're going to see a lot of really wonky black market products coming out. So, chocolate bars that might not even have mushroom or whatever other product they're saying in there, because there's no testing and there's no accountability yet in the market. The market needs to be above board and have the light shown on it first. So that might come, but I think the popularity of these products is going to really push towards us, voting to make these legal. The high-end consumer packaged goods, like you wouldn't be able to tell they weren't sold from Whole Foods in a lot of cases. So, how do we try to make people safer when this kind of thing is coming? Yeah, you can't, I think as you said earlier, you can't really stop a moving train like this. You can be a great steward, though, and try to help people make better decisions and be safer and kinder to each other. What else is going to happen? There's going to be a really robust facilitation scene here. I don't know what the taxation, like the licensing is going to look like, but I hope they make it workable for people who want to be involved full time and doing this stuff, that they can afford it. There's some really great equity inclusion. So I don't know the specifics there, but they made it so that no county or municipality could ban these things, these clinics that will be coming from a regulated frame. So there won't be kind of like psychedelic deserts. Like you can find your clinic and go get help. And that I think should be That should be amazing. And I think what else will happen? We're going to see some cool innovation as well. So not everybody is well enough to even swallow food, right? Um, and in Oregon, the rule was only oral administration of psilocybin. I think there's going to be other routes of administration allowed, which will be really good because, yeah, like not everybody can swallow things or like keep things in their stomach for more than 2 seconds, right? So, things like IV patches, intramuscular injections, like topical creams might be really good. There's so much exploration, like we just don't know. Like we've been not allowed to experiment for so long. If we look at cultures like, the Amazon, there's so many topicals, there's so many like different kinds of things, eye drops, like there's so much, beverages, like even rectal administration, honestly, like it's kind of like wonky to even talk about it, but there are medical reasons why that's a good route of administration for some people in some cases. So I think we're going to see a lot of really cool development there outside the scope of the FDA, which it's like 200-300 million to push anything through. So I think we're going to see kind of a really interesting market where we can get a lot of, good experience and hopefully learn and heal a lot of people. I am a little worried about cost. Like whenever regulation comes in, cost goes up a lot. And they just see it, politicians often see it as a cash cow, and the cash cow nature of it and the taxing schemes force the black market to be more robust. Legacy market maybe is the term we'll use. And we don't want to play this cat and mouse game at scale. We want people to be safe. So I think it's better to keep taxation really low so that people can have more of an interest in being more compliant with state law. And it's going to be really complicated because there's federal law against what we're doing. So there's no really traditional way to get loans, to get buildings or leases or whatever it is you're doing. So there's going to be a lot of really weird business around that stuff too. But I'm excited because it's effectively now a sanctuary state for psychedelic religious organizations that play their cards right. So I'm really excited about that too. That's kind of long and short of what we'll see in the next couple of years, I think. And it'll probably only get weirder from there. And worth noting, we're probably going to launch a school in Colorado as well. And we aim to have really, really affordable education that's, top tier quality.
And how do you see that relationship transpiring with the federal government? Maybe for non-Americans, kind of the idea of the United States of America was that the idea was a very decentralized system that ultimately the individual had the most power, and then your community, and then the state. And really the idea was the federal government had very minimal power, especially outside of international issues like the national border. And the idea being that states could decide, essentially their own fates, their own destiny. But that's certainly changed the nature of the federal government, the nature of people's citizens' ideas of the rights and powers of the federal government. So with that being the case, with Colorado taking this initiative, and yet on the federal level, all of these substances still being illegal, and in some cases, class 1 federal crimes, where do you see that interplay happening? Like, how is that dance going to transpire?
Answer is that there's no clear indications yet, as far as I can tell from the feds. I think given how much capital and like how much attention is here now in psychedelics, the feds are a little bit afraid. I don't know if you caught the case where a nurse, a single mom nurse in Indiana, was arrested and possibly going to go away for 10 years and have her child removed from her custody for microdosing, growing her own mushrooms and microdosing for her own mental health. Like, that was a big flare up. The feds weren't there, but that's an example of what one state was willing to do to a working nurse mother who was worried about health. So there's still some scary stuff there. What I'm seeing most people do is try to structure everything so that they can operate very similarly to how cannabis businesses are operating. So you can't do banking. You have to run around with a whole bunch of cash, right? And it's questionable, and exposes people to a lot of risk. Like my partner used to have to travel with a lot of cash for the cannabis business she was working in.
Could you still do banking like on a state level with a bank that's not FDIC insured?
There are some pathways now. I think there's people working on it, but I'm not super sure of who is going to accept it. Like I don't ever touch plants in my business, and we've been shut down by our banks too, which is crazy. Wow. Multiple banks have had big issues with us. So the feds, by not acknowledging it's happening, banks are a little nervous about their status. Like they don't want to lose their status with the feds, so they're just really finicky and they want really risk averse. So that's a big deal. There are federal laws in the books where if a landlord knows that federally illegal stuff is going on, I think this is Joe Biden's RAVE Act, they can come in and take all of your property and put you in jail. So like, say you had a big farmhouse or hotel and you were allowing people to do sessions there, the whole thing could be removed from your possession and also face legal and other consequences. So it's a little scary. But that said, people are willing to take this risk. I'm seeing a lot of really brave business people jump in and start operations domestically. And Oregon, case in point, they're already rolling out facilities and trying to figure that out. I wish I had more certainty. I think they're going to stay away from it because there are pretty powerful people in DC who have a strong interest in psychedelics, from both healing themselves and healing their family. Like case in point, Hunter Biden, big time psychedelic person. He's regularly doing checking back in with 5-MeO-DMT and iboga for his kind of like addiction maintenance stuff. So that's my understanding of it. And there's plenty of others that are doing that too from the political side. How many rich, political children are going to have substance issues? It's kind of a no-brainer, right? You have money and privilege, and like you're going to run into issues with substance at a certain point if you have all that access in the world. So there's a lot of influential people there. And then, on the veteran side, like right before we jumped on here, I saw something like the Veterans Administration here that takes care of war vets, 22% budget reduction this year, but they're already at 56 suicides a day. And like, how do you, or maybe 45 is the number, 45. Yeah. How do they justify that? And there are people that care in the government. I did some lobbying recently, and we only educated Republican lawmakers and their staff in DC, and the response was very surprising and very positive. As soon as you started talking about moms and veterans, they were all about it. And you just said, hey, like, where's the hope in the VA? Like, yeah, you can incrementally get better when your institution's that gigantic, but you're going to need some revolutionary treatments in there. And they are interested. I think the VA is operating their own MDMA trials, psilocybin trials. I know for sure there's a lot of veteran groups taking people to Peru and elsewhere to consume ayahuasca, which is amazing. And people are getting a lot of help. So I think they see it. There's plenty of testimony now. Like the Navy SEAL community is really loud. The Special Forces community is really loud. So it's changing the mind, but that doesn't mean that U.S. Marshals or the DEA will come in and not try to kick up a lot of dust and arrest people and cause a scene. Like, I don't know if you caught this, right before a lot of the decrim bills went in the United States, there was a number of raids. There's a really famous example in Denver, Cole. He had many DEA agents raid his small Denver apartment with a very, very, very small grow. It's probably 10 DEA agents and dogs in the works. And then there's another guy in DC who imported San Pedro, which is apparently quite legal to import to the United States. Customs flagged it as peyote. And he received a visit from 7 different, it was something like 4 to 7 different government agencies like marshals, DEA, etc., all armed with his, 7-year-old daughter there and mother in the room too. So all at gunpoint for fucking San Pedro. So this is how the government has responded. So the answer is, I don't know. I don't think anybody can really have certainty, but I think if we operate with integrity and real care, we can try to make sure we're all, safe, from the consumer to the producer and provider. Like, I think the consumer is at the least amount of risk, like the client, but there's still risk, right? I just wish it could be a little more calm and straightforward. What I would love to see is a statement from the Oregon and Colorado state government that says, if there is federal intervention here, we're going to help you and we're going to defend you. Because for a long time, California cannabis operators were getting raided all the time by feds, even though they were very compliant at the state level. I'm a little extreme, but I would love to see, for instance, the state police of Colorado or Oregon arresting federal agents if they tried to pull something like that. Maybe that's too much fantasy, but that's kind of like, I would love to see that kind of defense, given that the voters said, yes, this is what we're doing, and we believe in this. Yeah.
That's horrifying. I didn't realize the veteran suicide rate was that high. I mean, that's
they were initially saying 22, but they recounted like the kind of peripheral ones, like drinking and driving, like hard drinking and driving. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. It's not okay.
Do you think, and this is getting into the realm of politics, which is, obviously very divisive, especially in the climate we're living in. But, for me, I'm very much libertarian in my line of thinking. And I think a big part of that is, as you said, that idea of cognitive liberty. And I think for some things we begin, there's a beautiful quote by, he was the most famous samurai. His name was Musashi. And he said, when you understand the way broadly, you see it in all things. And I think sometimes
7 Rings or something.
Yeah. Sometimes we need to see something kind of in scale of the craziness of how certain ideologies transpire. And as you said, I mean, just that statistic, the suicide of veterans, the drug wars that come with that, the loss of cognitive liberty, the loss of religious freedoms. And, these are all coming from these very centralized ideas of how people can live their lives. Do you think this kind of awakening of what is the government's right, what are personal freedoms, do you think it's also going to have a more expansive change where people start looking at other issues maybe in a similar way, like that this is in a way maybe a catalyst of just, often in this plant work we use this word cosmovision or worldview. And, it seems like this could be a catalyst of a very pronounced shift in our cosmovision. I mean, much like you were talking about even in transpersonal psychology, that how we look at the world shapes a lot. I mean, it literally creates our reality, and we can't know what we don't know. But once there is some kind of cathartic experience, which often can happen from plant medicine, it sets off a chain of reactions where we then start questioning things. And I wonder if that's something you thought about, that this one specific issue, even though maybe on a larger scale it may seem like a more minor issue, but that it could kind of be the beginning of a cathartic experience of people really just shifting their view on many different things.
That's one of my hopes, for sure. I lean on kind of Jamaica for some help here. I say things like, kind of reveals the Babylon system in a way, like, oh, look, you've been used, you are being lied to, and it's true, and it's unfortunate. There are good players, but even the ones you think are on your team might not be on your team, and that's a really hard thing to swallow for a lot of people. Like, you know, like we have this Democrat president in office right now, and I would have hoped that we'd made a lot more progress on climate. But if we look at something like the Exxon Valdez oil spill, like I don't believe that's been paid for yet and fully cleaned up by a major oil company, who also lied to us about climate data and put us in a much worse situation than we are in right now. So, I do hope, and I do think that once we see this kind of like screwing around and influence here, it's becoming more apparent every day, right? By how divisive American politics are, you're getting exposed hard on both sides all the time. And I think with the rapid development of AI, surveillance technology, nothing's secure anymore. That means they're not secure anymore either. Like those guys are using Signal too, and it's not that clean. So you can definitely see a pathway towards a more democratic future, given that these aristocrats, plutocrats might actually really get exposed for the bad stuff they have done and continue to do, and not just us as citizens getting pushed around. And I am hopeful that psychedelics will help shift that narrative. You're like, wait a second, why can't I have a chocolate bar? Like, why can't I buy psilocybin mushrooms at the store? Like, at a certain point, that's going to happen for a lot of people. And I think that will be an amazing day. Yeah, and I lean libertarian too. My only issue is I don't see how it's going to help with the climate crisis, but that's the major bubble. But I also, obviously it's not as clean a story as that. I identify more as politically confused, publicly. Yeah, I can't think my way out of the paper bag, other than, we all need to come together and be nicer to each other and keep developing this project we have going, including the philosophy angle, the cosmovision or cosmology or whatever we want to say. I used to have like 5 or 6 different words for cosmovision. I loved them all. I forget them all now, but they're amazing to have in the back pocket. But yeah, how do we make this major shift that we need to make from, hey, those people are treating us like livestock, or like how do we start treating everybody as humans with their own interests and experiences, inclinations? And one thing I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I was reading you ever heard of the author Diane Fortune? Diane Fortune. She wrote a lot of books in kind of Edwardian England, like Victorian England. Big time esotericist, occultist, magician, and she had this line analyzing kind of Christianity in her period of time, and she identified it as kind of like a bhakti yoga, which there's 7 other limbs of the yogic path, right? And it's kind of obvious that bhakti yoga is not going to work for all humans. And so, like, how do we allow for people to develop their own kind of paths that work for them? Because not everybody's going to, fit neatly into a single system, right? Kind of like I love Noam Chomsky's framing of anarcho-syndicalism, where people can kind of like opt in or opt out of that organization, that government. I love that idea. And it's kind of like direct democracy. It's smaller scale. And that's one of the big problems. We're such a big country here. 3rd largest country in the world by population, biggest country by GDP and carbon emissions, et cetera. So like, how do we find a way to balance that? I don't know the answer, but I know it's something we should really be thinking about. And I often encourage people like, oh, how can you just live outside that system? It's there, but you don't need to conform to it all the time, right? So I try to help people brainstorm really interesting ways, and partly inspired by kind of like commune culture, permaculture culture, and yeah, some just interesting hippie movements that I've seen, like the Grateful Dead movement, like just, 20,000 people just following a band forever and ever and ever. Like, it's kind of amazing. I don't know how much progress they made, but they definitely did some interesting exploration.
Kind of like straw manning the other side. One of the the ideas behind regulation is, life in general has risk. There's potential downside to everything. And, certainly there was a lot of propaganda with kind of psychedelic drugs, recreational drugs. But always one of the arguments was this idea that these things would make you crazy and you die, or you'd go and start raping women, or you'd be lazy. Depending on the time frame, you were either lazy or it would make you hyperactive and want to rape and kill everyone, depending on what the the propaganda wanted to put at you. But one thing that I saw with the marijuana movement, and again, I'm very much for legalization. Even more than legalization, not criminalization. I just don't think the government should have any say whatsoever. Having said that, one thing I noticed with the marijuana legalization movement was it seemed like it was being purported as this was a panacea, cure-all. There were no downsides. There's no problems in children smoking marijuana. There's no risk of psychosis, and those things are just false. And I think, more evidence is coming out to show that there are downsides. And again, you have to put things in a relative perspective. I think in the US, it's something like 250,000 people are dying every year from pharmaceutical, complications in hospitals. These are tremendous numbers, which marijuana will never reach anywhere near that. Not even a fraction of it. But also to pretend like there are absolutely no downsides, I think is also disingenuous. So where do you think is that line as these, for lack of better terms, psychedelic medicines become more mainstream or more public? Where do you think, or if there is any kind of obligation on people like myself, like yourself, people who are involved in this community to point out the downsides, to think about things like safety, to educate people on what are the potential risks? Are there certain people who shouldn't be working on this? Is there any way to have a completely safe environment? Is that even actually a realistic goal, or do we have to accept, a certain level of inherent risk in that?
Right. Like, safety is a fiction. It's not real. And if you think TSA in the United States is keeping you safe, it's probably not. It's a theater. It's a theatrical project, and it's unfortunate to have to say stuff like that. And if you want to go to the extreme, just as an example, like asteroid could hit tomorrow. We don't know. and was that LSD safe? Didn't matter. So another point, like the establishment, the DEA and other organizations like DARE and whatever their European equivalents were, did a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar campaign of lying and misinformation. And we need to now dig our way out of that. And we do need honesty. A lot of people go too far the other way and want to say, oh, there's no harms, there's no risks. Like I was chatting with a gentleman the other day from Gabon, and he was suggesting absolutely zero risk from Iboga. And I'm like, maybe I would have to like really dig into some data here, but I know there's some really serious, scary cardiac stuff that can go down. So, leaning on the data, this is where science becomes really, really important. Because the politicians I was talking about were really impressed when you drop names like UCLA, Hopkins, and other major organizations, right? It's a balancing act, but I always point towards the David Nutt harm scale. Are you familiar with that one from the Lancet, maybe a decade or two ago?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. It got him fired from the UK government. He was the drug czar of the UK at the time. And it showed that alcohol was the most harmful to self and others, and psilocybin and LSD were the least harmful. And this was just ranking like the most commonly used substances at the time in the UK. And how, like, orders of magnitude smaller harm. Like, people should go check that out. Lancet, David Nutt, drug harm scale. And you'll find some really amazing graphics about like the relative harms. And you know, if we're saying alcohol and nicotine are fine, everything's safer than them, according to David Nutt, should be immediately decriminalized, and then working towards a safe, regulated frame, so we know what we're getting. Like the biggest harm here comes from ignorance, both on the education side and ignorance about what we're actually being sold and consuming. You know, if every MDMA pill was the same dose, people would be a lot safer and there'd be a lot less hospitalizations. Same thing with, you know, LSD, there'd be a lot less hospitalizations from people panicking if they knew exactly the dose. And similarly with mushrooms, it would be nice. Like mushrooms are incredibly variable, batch to batch. Like I'm super big supporter of home grows. I'm never going to change on that point. But, you know, people need to be aware of the fact, and this is an education problem, that there's so much potency difference, even mushroom to mushroom, like in the same tray. And likewise in ayahuasca, like when we say we think we know what ayahuasca is, like ayahuasca is like thousands of things. There's not one ayahuasca, right? It's like each tradition has their own blend and brew process and added mixtures and ways of serving it, and so much. Like even the aging process, like I'm a little freaked out about aged ayahuasca. You know, let's make a really moldy product, skim off the mold, boil it, and serve it. It's like I don't want to like denigrate that as a practice. Like I think there could be some interesting magic that happens there, but I would want the users to be informed about that far before they even wrote a check, right, to go. Just it seems risky from, you know, from a number of different perspectives for a weak Western biome to jump into one that's so, you know, strong in the Amazon. So like it's all over, right? And it's about education, and it's about fighting our way out of, again, a multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade campaign of lies and violence against our people. And our religious movements, and, you know, what we think is right and should be available to everybody. So yeah, it's kind of, that's the mission. And that's kind of like, how do we fight our way out of that? And that's a really big deal. And fairly too, like, let's not go so far as we're the ones doing propaganda. I don't know how to do that for everybody. I know how to do it for me. So I think really carefully, when I'm trying to speak truth. And then there's like gradients of truth, right? It's like, how much does this person really need to know? Do they really need a 50-minute lecture right now? Or, you know, how do we communicate such dense stuff in a short period of time? I don't know the answer there, but it's important to ask, I think.
One of the points that you mentioned that you feel quite passionate about is as you described it, the climate crisis. And, you know, one of I think the points that you speak about is the environmental impacts of or through psychedelics. So is that maybe something you can talk about? And also, I find it interesting because I think for many reasons, it seems like there is a symbiosis happening where, as certain things are happening on a massive scale, there is the emergence of these plants or psychedelic medicines. And you know, even from a more traditional or esoteric point of view, like as above, so below, like none of these things are inherently disconnected. And so do you think the emergence of a lot of these plant medicines or psychedelics is actually one of the remedies for that? Because it, you know, again, people's experiences are so different. And so it's hard to stereotype any of these plant medicines and the experience that people are going to have. But it does seem like a fairly common archetype is that people do have some sort of experience where they realize that they're not inherently disconnected, that they realize that the earth, that the universe is magnificent, much greater than they ever thought, that there is this interconnection between things, that they can maybe communicate with insects or plants, and that there's other life forms that have a consciousness that's maybe different, but not necessarily better or less than. And, you know, it just seems, as we were talking about, it seems to shift the cosmovision of people into a more holistic worldview, which, you know, is also the root of healing, which is where so much of this kind of psychedelic culture is emphasizing, is this idea of healing. And to be healed means to be whole. And I think part of that holistic view is realizing that I am deeply interconnected with my environment. And, like without getting on the political side, like what are necessarily the remedies of that? Like it seems like there maybe is something that's happening with the plant medicines that is, in essence, reconnecting us to maybe something that we've been cut off from, that we had always had access to, but that potentially that was even one of the main aspects of these plants, was that relational aspect of ourselves and our environment.
So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
There's this Jim Fadiman book, My Symphony of Selves, or something like that, talking about how we contain multitudes of selves. And it depends on the lens and the day, my opinion on a lot of this. Like, I think from a certain perspective, like, I am the earth. We are the earth. Like, we're no different from nature. We are nature. And not only that, like, I am the same thing as Mars or the Milky Way or whatever it is, right? Like, bigger and bigger scales. And I can get that esoteric, and I like to do that. But I'm also like, what does this climate crisis project about what's going on inside of all of our hearts and souls? And tumult. Yeah, it's forcing a physical crisis to make us get on the right track again. And Sam Gandy published a paper a few years back about nature relatedness after psychedelic experience, and that was a really good one. I think that might be the only paper still on that topic, and it was a relatively small sample size, so we can't like lean on it fully. But in my lived experience, it seems that as though when people are consuming psychedelics on a occasional, if not semi-regular basis, their environmental awareness grows, and they're more in tune with this, and they say, oh, like hurting that forest also hurts me and my family and people that come later, like that whole 7 generations thing. And yeah, the relational thing, like what is my relationship to that, to you, to everything else? And questioning it, like it's a big process that can get kicked off by psychedelics. Not always, but often. And yeah, it's a fascinating question. Are these things coming about now to say, hey, in order to get through this outrageously tight thing, it's kind of like a Luke Skywalker Death Star situation almost. Like we've got a shot, but we've got to take it really well. And psychedelics kind of are showing that, right? Like some people are going down with it, but most people are soaring and growing and becoming more amazing with the use of these things. But yeah, some people do, dip out, but it's, yeah, it's a really hard thing. Like maybe, like on a good day, I'll say yes. On a bad day, I'll say maybe. So yeah, like I lean towards the yes and affirmative, that the timing seems really interesting here on that. And then, how should we be in relation to these things as a species? It's a really big question. I don't have the right answer. I'm very curious on other people's opinions. Often I'll disagree, but if flying is one of the worst things for the planet, and like one of the worst things we can do, it's not exactly true, everybody. Like trying to decrease militarization, I think, would help more than you taking a couple flights every year. And trying to get green infrastructure in place everywhere, like that's probably better than abstaining. But it's a pretty major impact to like fly a lot of people to do these ceremonies around the world. And we have to really think carefully about that. Is that really what we want? Is that the right thing to scale? And then that's why I'm hopeful about things like Colorado and Oregon, making it closer to home for a lot of people. Really, really hopeful about that. I just hope we can execute well there. And, perhaps in a couple of years we'll have hydrogen powered planes, and then we don't have to worry about it as much. I know there's plenty of R&D going on there. So yeah, this is all transitional. Everything's in flux, all is flow. Panorrhea. I think that was Heraclitus. Like, how do we just understand, like, the only permanent thing is change, and like you're clinging to the old might be hurting you and hurting others around you. And yeah, I think that's the relational piece. Like, then that'll, help us move forward. Like, do you really need that gigantic truck? Like, you work at an office. Like, what are you doing? Like, couldn't you have like an e-bike instead that weighs 1/1000th the weight? It doesn't require direct, petrol in there. Like, so there, and this is the relational piece that I think eventually will come to a head. People will want to mature. People will want to be kinder to everybody, I hope, and see that these division lines, like Israeli, Palestinian, it's not like, we don't have to think of each other as so different. Like, you're all human. You might have your own stories, but let's like try to heal these things and heal the other parties. And like in America, I'm seeing us like apparently getting torn to shreds over like political division and further extreme political opinions and positions. And like Florida is a case in point. It's like the best thing from this whole Florida situation, I don't know if you're watching it all, it's getting really ugly down there. Like, some of my best friends are moving back to Colorado. So I'm like, oh yeah, hell yeah. But I'm sorry you had to leave everybody down there. It's a real bummer. But, how do we constantly reflect on our relationship to the world? I think that's a practice that could be really good. Like, yeah. And asking those basic questions. Who am I? Where am I coming from? Where am I going? What should I be doing with this life? I think asking those questions is pretty important, fundamental to us, getting through this climate thing. I don't want to see more martyrs. Like, I've martyred myself in the past. It's not all that fun. And there's ways we can do this in a more holistic frame. And, fit in, play, and rest, and connection, and the rest of it, right? It's yeah, it's something that we're going to have to work hard to do, but I think we can do it. And I think psychedelics can and will play a big part of it. And there's so many people out there that think psychedelics are the thing that can help us through. That's a very common thought. Like, I don't want to be super dogmatic about that, but I believe in large part that there's a lot of truth there.
Can you talk a bit about the school you're starting? Because I think that's a really interesting idea, and I would imagine something that's going to be kind of part of more mainstream culture going forward. So I think it's very, very interesting, actually starting something like that up. So what are your ideas with that? What would like the curriculum look like? Who would that appeal to?
Well, just like everything, it's a process. So to start, what we did last year was effectively like a liberal arts education in psychedelics. We don't want people to get too niched out in our programs. We can add in the niche material later once you have a broad survey understanding, and it could be a kind player in all these areas and helpful player. And then, you can add on IFS or individual substances later to your toolkit if that's what you're going to do. And we are interested in opening a real deal school to start. That'll probably be like postgraduate certificates and then graduate degrees. And then hopefully we can do some like undergrad stuff as well. And like, I'm not in love with all that naming and like conventional stuff, but it's the system we have right now. And we can be transitional by design, hopefully, towards something that feels better for everybody. And yeah, like my hope would be that we can merge in ecological thinking with psychedelic thinking with, better ways of parenting and being and kind of develop some really interesting and helpful folks in the world. And yeah, so far in our first year, we gave away $211,000 of scholarship, all self-funded at first. We got maybe like $10,000 or $15,000 from some partners to help with that. And then this last round, I think we did over $500,000 US in scholarship
Wow.
with not a proportional student increase. So more than double this year, which is great. So like, I want to keep access going. I want to, help with diversity, because it doesn't really move the needle if it's only white folks here, right? We need people of all walks of life and backgrounds to be a part. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I think it'll be in Colorado. If we can develop the vision further in the next couple of years, that'd be amazing. I just want to keep getting people in our fold. And another thing we've been doing is finding really cool players in the space who are educators already to come teach on our platforms, and we can make it easier for them and hopefully more lucrative and get their message out in a bigger way. So we've had some partners join our platforms there. That's been really nice. So I think we're doing a neuroscience course, a microdosing course, and we've done some history programs in the past that have been really good. And I'm hopeful to just keep building that out and make sure the instructors are well compensated too. There's a lot of clinicians that'll teach continuing ed courses, and they'll get like $20 for teaching, and that's not enough. It's really unfair. And we want to kind of like shift that dynamic back to making sure people are taken care of in a good way. We're a for-profit operating like a nonprofit, but I think, hopefully that works in the long run.
Well, great, Joe. This was a pleasure. I know we're coming up on our time slot, but are there any topics we didn't touch on that you'd like to talk about?
There's one final one. The Psychedelic Medicine Coalition is a group that's really important to me. And this is me being a walking contradiction, but I know it and I'm aware of it. But I think science funding from the federal government is one of the most critical things that we can resource to help people and improve drug policy largely. And Psychedelic Medicine Coalition is actively lobbying Congress every day to get science funding into universities, into independent research groups and elsewhere, so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on here with these substances and get better buy-in long-term from politicians and industry and elsewhere to radically transform healthcare and spirit care, honestly, as if they're different. But how do we move that forward? It's through science and careful lobbying about the right way to do this at the federal scale. And they've also spun up a PAC, which means that people can donate money there to get important politicians, strategic politicians for our movement elected, to help keep this psychedelic, thing progressing. And worth noting too, like, this is psychedelics. This is not drug policy as a whole. Like, drug policy as a whole, wildly racist. The sentencing disparities are incredible. Like, I can get caught with cannabis and cocaine and get a $20 fine. If you're black, you could spend 20, 30, 40 years in prison, right? It's a really tough scene. So, that's the bigger thing that we need to change and move on. But in the meantime, let's do what's more politically practical, which is get science funding for this stuff so that we can help more people, keep people more safe, and keep healing the planet after we all get healed and get back on our feet. Because a lot of us got knocked down hard and can't get back up for a lot of reasons, and psychedelics can help. Yeah, it's probably good.
So the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, it's an organization that like various experts in their field participate in to try and forward this government scientific funding.
Yeah, and it's headed by a lobbyist, Melissa Lavasani. It's a nonprofit. It's a 501c7 or something, or C6, that allows for lobbying dollars and spend. And yeah, that's a nonprofit, and I'm a board member there. Jesse Gould from Heroic Hearts, Tom Zuber from Zuber Lawler, Ryan Costello, former Republican congressperson, is a board member there. It's a number of really amazing folks are on the board and working to make that happen. And then there's also a big advisory board. So I think like Matt Johnson from Hopkins is there. The head of Microdose is on the advisory board. So there's a lot of really interesting folks there trying to move it forward. And largely we're just saying we need science funding. We're not telling you what to spend that on. We're just saying we need the funding. And the veteran suicide number is a really easy point to say, hey, like, the VA is not preventing all these suicides. We need different and better interventions. And these things might really help. Yeah.
Yeah, great. If people are interested in reaching out to you or learning more, listening to Psychedelics Today, maybe more information in the school you're starting, the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, what are ways that they can go about doing that?
Yeah, follow me on socials. Largely Jomo137, Jomo137 on Instagram, Twitter. Not super active on Facebook, but follow our company pages too. Psychedelics Today. Twitter had a character limitation, so we're like Psychedelics Today. I had to figure that out. And yeah, our email list is pretty good. We've got some free classes if people want to check out some things on basic psychedelic harm reduction. I think we've even got one on starting your own church in America, which is pretty cool. It's not exactly a playbook, but you get a lot of legal opinions from a bunch of different really smart attorneys in that one. And yeah, it's probably good for now, but yeah, just stay tuned to us, subscribe on Spotify or wherever you listen. And yeah, we put out 2 episodes a week, so maybe more sooner than later.
Well, great, Joe. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing. It's been a pleasure, and yeah, I think you have a fascinating mind, and you're up to a lot of really good work. So I thank you for your work and coming on and sharing, and I wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jason. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone, that is it. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was really a pleasure for me to sit down and have Joe talk. I think he's doing some really amazing work and very much involved in this kind of emerging field. So yeah, I hope you all really enjoyed that. And again, it was really a pleasure for me to have him come on and share. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, that's a really big help. Patreon is a really good option. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. Those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. To all of the patrons, to all the people who are supporting that way, as always, thank you very much for your support. And if you're able to do that, that's a really big help. I really like the idea of sites like Patreon, which are based upon this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, that's an amazing way to give back. If you're not able to do that, as always, helping with the algorithms is also a really big help in getting this show out to a bigger audience. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving any questions or comments in the comment section, that's a really big help. There's also video versions on Rumble and Spotify now. And then with the audio version, Apple Podcast is still the big one, so following the show and leaving a starred rating and a short review, that's a really big help. Also with Spotify now, you can rate the show, which also very much helps. This is maybe the last of a series of interviews I'm shooting before I head off to Europe to begin working. I'm hoping to get a local Cerdo guy on named Victor, but I'm not sure if that's going to happen before I leave. But if not, it'll happen when I get back. And also another local guy named Andrew, who's really into different esoteric practices and a really fascinating guy too. So hopefully those will be the next episodes coming out. And so I think that's it. I hope this finds you all well. Thank you all for the support. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you all on the next one.